Hi, my name is Justin Harmon. I'll be presenting on this research paper titled Using Mice to Understand Human Compulsive and Anxiety Behavior. Some background information. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a psychiatric disorder that affects behavior, both obsessions and compulsions. OCD is the fourth common mental disorder and affects about 2.3% of people in the United States alone. Research suggests that this disorder is connected genetically, environmentally, and neurobiological factors that play in its development. And because the neurobiological factors have been discovered to be a role in its development, oftentimes OCD patients will develop other mental disorders such as anxiety, Tourette's syndrome, and various depression levels. In the past, researchers tested animals that resemble behaviors expressed by OCD patients to understand these other disorders. Certain behaviors of these animals include excessive grooming, repetitive routines, spontaneous alteration in normal behaviors or instincts, compulsively checking themselves or checking around, marble bearing, and compulsive-like nest-building behaviors. To understand the behavioral patterns of OCDs, they took and observed these animals, usually mice, and compared them to the behavioral patterns or profiles in humans. This is known as a face validity animal models. There's a different types of validity. I'm not going into detail into them, but there's predictive validity and constructive validity, both of which go into more detail on pharmaceutical behaviors and interactions with these behaviors and predictive behaviors based on research. We are testing a spontaneous mouse model to understand OCD and anxiety-like behaviors by comparing compulsive-like and anxiety-like behaviors of mice to discover potential correlation between these mice and those of OCD patients. We set up 4 tests that compared the strain of mice bred to be big nest builders, small nest builders, and then used a random breed control strain that had intermediate nest building behaviors. The 4 tests that were set up was nest building model, which is based off of Bilt, Ito, and Lynch's nest building model, and marble bearing, both of which test compulsive-like behaviors, and open field test and elevated zero maze test that tests anxiety-like behaviors. And we use these tests to divide the compulsive-like and anxiety-like behaviors in these mice and compared them to humans and themselves, really. My hypothesis is that we will find a correlation between compulsive-like behavior and anxiety. My prediction is that the compulsive-like mice will have a higher anxiety-like behavior than the non-compulsive-like mice. And the random breed control will have intermediate anxiety-like behavior. And that our model will actually meet the necessary requirements for a face validity model. Background on the animals. Each mouse was handled in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Provided the protocol there. The strains that were used were HA strains, or the big nest builders, the LA strains, the small nest builders, and the CA strains, the random breed control strains. Total of mice used was 90, which is 14 to about 16 per strain of mouse per group. Each mouse was housed in a polyurethane cage, 27 by 17 by 12, was placed underneath a 12 to 12 hour light to dark cycle at room temp to simulate natural environments, with wood chippings for the floor. Each cage had a metal wired top with a food hopper and a section for a water bottle. Water was given freely without restriction, and the type of food that was used was Mazri, which is a rat and mouse diet. Each mouse was ear tagged and given an ID number, and then randomly assigned to a group to be studied. The nest building model, before each test was used, the mouse was weighed. Each mouse was weighed and then placed in a clean cage with the same dimensions, with fresh wood chippings and enough food and water for 2 days. A cotton roll was then placed on the food hopper or next to the food hopper compartment, about 25 to 50 grams. It was weighed before placing on the top and then weighed at 24 hours after. The difference between the weights in the cotton is the nesting score in grams. The marble bearing test, a rat cage was placed with 5 centimeters of wood shavings, and then it was evenly pressed down. On the surface, 20 marbles was evenly spaced out, and then each mouse was placed in the cage one at a time and recorded for 20 minutes. And then we took the data from the amount of marbles buried at 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20-minute segments. The open fill test was a square box of plexiglass that the floor was divided into 16 squares. 4 squares was the central square, made of the central square, and each square was 10 by 10 each. And then a plexiglass was placed on the floor, and then each mouse, it was disinfected after each use. 3 behaviors that was quantified here was the latency to leave the central square, the time spent in the central square, and the number of lines crossed. A video camera was set up to document each reaction, and each mouse was removed from the container after 5 minutes. The elevated zero maze test was a circular maze that was elevated 40 centimeters above ground. A ring platform on top was separated into 4 quadrants. 2 segments had walls on the outside rim and an inside rim that was to enclose the circular rim or platform. And then 2 segments was the open segment. Each mouse was then placed in one at a time in the enclosed wall portion and recorded for 3 minutes. And then the quantified data was how long each mouse was on the open segments of the platform. The results was the nest building scores. HA strains is significantly different than the rest of the strains. It had the most. The CA strains had the intermediate values, and the LA strains had the least. And then when you're comparing that with the body weight of each mouse, is as followed. The HA strains had the most body weight, the CA strains had intermediate weight, and the LA strains had the least. The stars represent a significant difference between them and the rest of the data. The diamonds represent a significant difference between those strains and the LA strains, and the green twinkling star above HA1, it signifies that between the HA strains they were significantly different. The same goes with the body weight graph here. In the marble bearing test, the HA strains had the most buried marbles per time frame. The CA strains on average, had the intermediate numbers of marble buried, and the LA strains had the least. Between the LA strains, there was a significant difference. LA2 was higher than LA1. And there was a significant difference between the CA1 and CA3. CA3 was slightly higher, and in the marble bearing, the HA3 and the HA1 was the most. It was the most. In the elevated zero test results, HA strain had the most, and the LA strain overall had the least, an exception of the CA1 strain, which had the least overall, and the HA1 strain, which had the most. The star represents that the HA1 strain was significantly different than the CA1 strain and the rest of the data. The latency to leave, the open field test. This is the results for the open field test. The latency to leave the center square. As you can see, the LA strains had the most, followed by the CA strains, and the HA strains had the least amount of time to leave. The star represents a significant difference between the LA2 strain and the rest of the strains, to include the LA1 strain here. Using that, comparing to the rest of the data, the time spent in total, the center square, as you can see, the LA2 strain in this case had the least amount of times in the center square. Overall, the HA strains had the most time in the center square. CA strains had the intermediate values, and with the exception of the LA1 strain, which had almost the same amount of time spent as the HA3 strains. The average lines crossed, as you can see again, the LA2 strain had the least, followed by the LA1 strain. CA strains and the HA strains has significantly difference between the two of them. CA3 and CA1 almost have the same. They're slightly different, as well as HA1 and CA strains, CH3 strain. So what does this all mean? First, my hypothesis was that we would find a correlation between the compulsive-like behavior and anxiety. And that was ultimately supported. My prediction is that the compulsive-like mice would have higher anxiety-like behavior, and the non-compulsive-like mice than the non-compulsive-like mice. That was not supported. But the random breed control did have intermediate anxiety behavior comparative. So that was supported, but the other portion was not. In the nest building models, as you can see, HA strains had the most. And this is all consistent with past researchers. What happened is that in some cases, research has found that the comorbidities varies among the OCD patients. And that is the reason why it wasn't supported. Any questions?